How's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Friday, January 31st. It's the end of the month, and I have a special one for you because, as some of you are aware, Gideon Lazar, Byzantine Scotus, everybody knows who he is, but Gideon, he did a debate. This was yesterday. Yesterday in the middle of the day, did a debate on Daniel chapter 9 and how Daniel chapter 9 is used as a messianic prophecy, and debated a Jew on it. And, well, debated a religious Jew on it. And it was a fun debate. It was very interesting. And it was, what I noticed about it is I've really never seen a debate kind of get that detailed. I guess the closest thing would be, the Eric Ybarra debate with Uwe Petrus on the papacy. But it really got very, very, very detailed. I very much appreciated that. But I think what would be helpful for it is if in this debate review, because this is kind of a debate review, I guess, but we contextualized it a lot. So you can watch what we say here, and then you can go to the debate and have a much richer appreciation for what was said here. Gideon's here, Hasan's here. I guess that's all that I have to say for an intro. But Gideon, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys. I thought it'd be interesting, the three of us together, like one former Protestant, one former Muslim, one former Jew, and take different perspectives. Because I do think these are three areas where our apologetics to our former co-religionists are very, very different. Like, we all have to take very unique approaches. And I feel like there's not been good Catholic apologetics responding to Judaism. Like, what I have to do at this point right now is I first point them to Protestant resources responding to Judaism, and then I point them to the Catholic responses to Protestantism. It's almost like two steps. So that's what I want to do, is actually build a set of resources, because I think we actually have the tools in the Catholic tradition itself to properly respond to Judaism, and at a much deeper and richer level than Protestants can respond to Judaism. Like, at one point in our debate, he objected that Christ cannot be the anointed prince here, because the word for prince in Hebrew here, nagid, refers to having temporal authority. So we need to understand the church's temporal authority in order to make sense of this prophecy, for example. No, it's only once we have a Catholic understanding of ecclesiology that we can actually, and also sacramentology as well, that we can properly respond to Judaism.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because I was recently using this for a very different purpose, because I'm involved with some political stuff in North Dakota, and I was the ghostwriter of a Christ is King bill. And somebody actually objected that this is completely unconstitutional on the basis that it establishes a monarchy, and the Constitution is against a monarchy. So I went to Catholic sources, and Catholic sources are extremely detailed over the ways in which we say that Christ has temporal authority over the nations, and the way that doesn't dissolve, particularly the autonomy and proper dignity of local government, of the governments of each one of the nations. So it is very interesting how precise Catholicism is in being able to answer particular objections. But I think the whole project is great, because this actually is analogous. Stop laughing, son. I know.
I keep remembering what you said about the guys who were like, "What's this Apoc thing? That looks
no.
Deuterican," and then you were like,
"Yeah,
that's what we call Revelation."
Yeah, what's the apoc thing? They thought that was apocrypha rather than
What's this
apocalypse.
APOC thing?
The APOC. Yes, the APOC thing.
APOC for Apocrypha real.
Yeah, that's real. But it is very interesting how your approach with because I haven't really seen this with either Muslims or Jews or really Protestants for that matter. I guess we all kind of do our same little thing in our little corners of the internet, because when I deal with Protestants, I deal with Protestants in a very particular way that not many Catholics deal with them, especially with Reformed Protestants and Lutherans, where I do go to their sources and might appeal to their tradition, maybe in verification, even in verification of something that we commonly agreed upon in
Yeah.
their tradition. Like, for example, a lot of them will critique our teaching on concupiscence and marriage, and then you say, well, in your tradition, you actually have an even harsher view of this. So why are you critiquing us for being like anti-sex, which is a common critique? And Hasan does that with Muslims, and you do that with Jews, and it's very interesting.
A big thing here is, for example, like there's a lot of people dealing with Jews, they don't know the Jewish tradition really at all. And so, like, as an example, I was listening to Tovia Singer, who is sort of like the chief apologist for Judaism online. And he was criticizing the New Testament because the New Testament takes Hosea chapter 2, those who are not my people, I will call my people. And the New Testament applies that to the Gentiles. And Tovia said that's taking it out of context, because in the context, it's clearly talking about the northern tribes of Israel who are going to be sent into exile. Because in chapter 1, he tells the prophet Hosea to go to the northern kingdom and call them not my people. But what's interesting is I went and looked up that verse, and I looked it up in Jewish cross-references, and I found it in the Talmud. And the Talmud says that the reason the Jews have been sent into exile is so that they might win converts among the nations. Because as it is written in Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people. So the Jewish tradition actually agrees with our reading of this. Same with Isaiah 53, like all over the Jewish tradition. This is either about the Messiah ben David, or more interestingly, it's just something people don't know about. There's a figure in the Jewish tradition, goes all the way from Scripture through in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, all the way through later Jewish commentaries until the modern day, that there's going to be a second Messiah called the Messiah, the son of Joseph. And he is going to die outside the gates of Jerusalem, as it's in fulfillment of Isaiah 53 and Zechariah 12, which the Talmud explicitly, when talking about him, quotes Zechariah 12, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. And they basically view the figure of Joseph as having a messianic fulfillment, just like David is going to have a messianic fulfillment. Basically, everything we say about the first coming of Christ, they say about the Messiah, the son of Joseph. And of course,
yeah,
Jesus,
this is actually
Joseph.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
This is actually something which a lot of people, especially because a lot of our followers, all three of us, end up being a little bit more on the right-wing anti-Zionist sphere of things. I mean, all three of us are anti-Zionists when it comes to political Zionism, and religious Zionism. But when it comes to those in this category, often they will like look down on people for quoting Jewish sources. Like if I was exegeting an Old Testament passage and I said, "Oh, this is what Maimonides says," or "Oh, this is what the Talmud says," like instantly you just get this like this whiplash of you're not allowed to quote those sources. But what's interesting is that when you look into the Catholic tradition of the exegetes were like practically falling over themselves to learn Hebrew so they could read Jewish exegetes in order to better understand the literal sense of the Old Testament. So it is very much within our tradition to do exactly what you're doing with reading Jewish exegetes.
Yeah, because these Jewish exegetes, right, a lot of them are thinking about, for example, let's take the law, for example, right? They're thinking on a daily basis about how do I actually practically apply this. So they're going to, in practice, have spent a lot more time thinking about those verses, trying to look for cross-references or other sorts of things. And so they're going to be useful sources to have. I thought Judaism lacks is the framework to contextualize everything. Right? Every culture, I think, understands itself just in terms of itself better than other cultures understand them. But they don't understand how their culture fits into the overall framework versus we have the incarnation. So we have the ultimate purpose of everything. So we have the ability then to contextualize every other culture. So this is actually something I find really interesting, is that Judaism has had a really hard time understanding why Christianity and Islam have been so successful. Because they essentially have the issue that now like 50% of the world are monotheist because of a Jewish messianic claimant in the first century. And so this is a huge issue within the Jewish tradition. So you see in Maimonides, for example, he says, all right, Jesus is a false Messiah, but ultimately God's ways are greater than our ways. He must have been raised up in some way. Maimonides' theory is that through this, all the nations are going to find out about the Old Testament. They're going to find out about God. They're going to find out about the idea of a Messiah. And then when the real Messiah comes, everyone will realize, oh, we just got that last little part wrong. And so that's to reconcile it. But it's interesting.
That is kind of funny.
It's sort of going to be like for them, like the real Messiah shows up and everyone already knows about God and the Torah and stuff. Like,
they're like, oh yeah, oh great. I'm glad the false Messiah guy all told us to read the Old Testament.
Yeah. And so this is something where we can take those genuinely good insights in other traditions and contextualize it in our own tradition. While also, of course, being careful to reject the very problematic statements in their traditions as well. Like, just because it's in there doesn't mean it's infallible or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, obviously Hasan talks about this a lot, but there is the obligation that one has with any sort of knowledge that comes from their background to even mix with the falsehood of error, obviously mix with certain falsehoods, that any truth that one has that they have learned from their backgrounds, they have an obligation to offer that up to the service of the church. Otherwise, one would be certainly less faithful to Christ and his church by not offering up what they had gathered from that background knowledge. But anyways, I wanted to move on particularly to the argument of Daniel chapter 9. I almost said Daniel chapter 7. I don't know why I keep trying to say Daniel chapter 7. But Daniel chapter 9, I wanted to move on to the specific argument, because this is, to my knowledge, this is quite a traditional argument from prophecy, because when we hear from like Vatican I, for example, or from a lot of our traditional apologetes, so those who teach apologetics, apologetes will say that there's two categories of verifying revelation. There's miracles, and especially the miracle of the conversion of the world by the Catholic faith, and then there's prophecy. But a lot of times people don't really know how to use prophecy because it's really difficult. So is Daniel chapter 9 kind of, in your mind, one of those really good places to go to in the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think this is like, really, in my opinion, this is the kill shot, because it's not only that this prophecy fits so well with our theology, it's also the case that you see how badly Judaism has to mangle this prophecy to try to even get something out of it. And then the other issue that I think is it's really interesting. I watched a video where someone went through how all the church fathers take this passage. There's about 15 times church fathers. This is a church father in the wider sense, just early Christian writers, comment on this passage. And he basically found like 15 for 15 different interpretations. And none of them really, I think, get it 100% right. I think Lapide actually gets it very well here. But I think what's interesting is it's because this prophecy relates so closely to issues of ancient chronology, because it gives us the exact years things are going to happen. And we really didn't have, like, it took me like using like Excel spreadsheets and stuff to make sure my numbers were correct. And I'm still not 100% sure in certain areas stuff is correct. Like, this chronology stuff gets so confusing. Even professionals nowadays use computer programs to try to do this kind of stuff. So I would like in the future to try to get the numbers here even more accurate. But I think this shows us sort of like a time bomb that was like in the scriptures here, that once we have all the modern resources at our hands on chronology, because we had the general chronology before, like Lapide is able to do it. But now we have like such overwhelming evidence for this chronology being correct that I really think it's just a kill shot here.
Oh, okay. So I can read this, and you can kind of take me through step by step what's going on in this passage. Okay, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, so it says, 70 weeks have been determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to end vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. Know and understand that from the going forth of a word to restore and to build Jerusalem, until an anointed prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And the street and the wall will be built again in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and it will end with a flood. And until the end of the war, desolations are determined. And he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will make sacrifices and offerings to cease. And on the wing of abominations will be a desolator, until the determined destruction is poured out on the desolator. So what's the context of this prophecy?
Yeah, so Daniel, basically, he's taken away at the very beginning of the Babylonian exile, and he lives through the entire Babylonian exile. And he gets a series of prophecies about basically what's going to happen from the time of the Babylonian exile until the coming of Christ. And this is one of those prophecies. So at this point, basically, a figure named Darius the Mede, it debated whether this is another name for Cyrus or if this is a sort of governor that was maybe there for like 6 months or a year before Cyrus took full power after conquering Babylon. But it's some sort of figure, basically, who has now ended the Babylonian exile. And Daniel's, at the beginning of the passage, he's going through the prophet Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's like, well, we're going to be in exile for 70 years. Like, the 70 years are up, and we're not going back. This seems like really, really bad. Especially because Jeremiah not only said 70 years, he then prophesied this new covenant that would come. Mm-hmm. And so he's waiting for this. And so he gives this great prayer where he prays, like, our people have sinned. We've gone into exile. I know we're still not being righteous. And he ultimately begs God, not on our own merit, but on your great mercy, to have mercy on us and bring us back. And so the angel Gabriel then comes and he basically says, look, Daniel, I'm going to clarify everything for you. And then he gives this prophecy that, like, honestly makes things way more confusing at first. But basically what he's telling Daniel is actually there was that 70-year period before, like, yeah, you had that, but there's also going to be another 70 times 7-year period of 490 years you're going to have to wait, of 70 weeks of years. But he says at that 70 years, right, we're going to have finished transgression, make an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, end vision and prophecy, and anoint the Holy of Holies. Like, the new covenant's going to come basically at the end of this time.
Okay, so you have like the original prophecies, and then there's 70 years, and then on top of the 70 years, there's the 70 weeks, which would just be 70 times 7, 490.
Yeah. So there's the question of when do we count this 490 years to start? So the way the Jews interpret this is they say that in Leviticus, God says, if you're unfaithful, I'm going to multiply your punishment 7-fold. So they take that and apply it to this and say what Gabriel is telling Daniel is that because you guys were unrighteous during the Babylonian exile, it's actually going to be multiplied 7 times. So from the time you went out from exile in Babylon, it's not 70 years, it's going to be 490 years. And Daniel, there's 2 different times where Jeremiah prophesies the 70 years. Some people think that's the same thing, like Jeremiah is pointing back and reminding them of that. Some people think it's 2 separate ones, like 2 distinct periods of 70. The Jews take that one. They basically say the first one was fulfilled when the Jews came back from Babylon, but the second period of 70, that's going to be multiplied by 7 to be 490 years. Now, the issue is, right, at the end of the prophecy, it mentions the destruction of the Second Temple. And so the Jews take this and they say, from the destruction of the First Temple until the destruction of the Second Temple is going to be 490 years. Now, the issue with that is that that's about 165 to 166 years short of how long that actually was, which creates a huge chronological issue for them. So they reject the standard chronology of ancient Persia and ancient Greece. And they say, like, all of ancient Greek and Persian history, like from, like, basically the Greco-Persian Wars until the Alexander the Great, like what we record as 200 years, they say all of that occurred in about 30 to 40 years. Okay,
so then I'm getting this right. We, because this is something I noticed in the debate, is, and this is something I trust a lot more, basically we know the sort of pinpoints of these relative dates. We know this from not just, obviously, just reading the Old Testament. We know this through reading secular historians everywhere from, the Peloponnesian Peninsula with the Greeks. We know that everywhere from there to the Persians, right?
Yeah,
This isn't just something that we know from the Old Testament or anything like that.
Exactly.
We need to go to outside history.
So we actually don't have a direct chronology of this period from the Old Testament. We basically have the Old Testament gives us a chronology from creation to the Babylonian exile and then stops giving us a chronology. And I actually think that's theologically important because in the book of Daniel, one of the major themes is that sovereignty has been handed over from Israel to the nations. And so I think this is in part God now saying, like, look, you're going to have to look to the nations to get your chronology now. But we have independent testimony of this in Greece, Persia, Babylon, and Egypt. Like pretty much perfect chronologies in those independent regions, as well as lots of other confirmatory evidence.
Okay. And really so going off of their chronology, you say it's way short. Going off of our chronology, when are we going to be counting to with these 70 weeks?
So this is disputed even among Christians because it says here. So basically, pretty much everyone agrees it's not from the first exile. Like that's too early. But it says here from the understanding of the going forth of a word to restore and to build Jerusalem. So we generally take that, all right, this is from a decree to rebuild Jerusalem. But which decree is it? And that's where the debate comes in. Because if you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, there's actually 4 different decrees given that have to deal with rebuilding Jerusalem. So now you have to figure out which of those 4 decrees is it. So I think the best case is that the first 2 decrees, they're actually about the rebuilding of the temple. Like if you look at the wording of them, they're not about the rebuilding of the city. And then you look at the last decree, which is in Nehemiah, and Nehemiah has to rebuild the walls. But you only have to rebuild the walls if a city already exists. But if you look at Ezra chapter 7, there's a decree there where it mentions how Ezra is going to have to be setting up basically government officials all over Jerusalem. So this, I think, has to do with the actual restoration of the city itself, because we didn't get that before, and we know it's already built afterwards. So this has to be the decree which does it. And interestingly, this places us so either in the year 458 or 457 BC. Because the issue is we know when the 7th year of Artaxerxes was, because that's what it says it is. The issue is the Jewish calendar starts at a different time of year than the Persian calendar. So how are the Jews counting the 7th year of Artaxerxes? When I read articles on both cases, the 457 date makes more sense to me, but the 458 date is not unreasonable. So I wanted the 457 date in the debate. But there's the thing is, I think you can move these dates around a year or 2, or maybe a few days at times and stuff. But it's not like you can move things by over 100 years or stuff like that. Like there's little bits of areas where we're not 100% certain, because it's not like people were using something like the Gregorian calendar. They were using local calendars dating by reigns of kings and so on. We also have this issue for the ministry of Christ, because we know John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. But the issue is that Tiberius had a co-regency with Augustus. So do you count from the beginning of his co-regency or the beginning of his sole rule? And there's good cases to be made for both of them. So that's, again, why you'll see some people date the ministry of Christ more from 27 to 30, and other people date it more from 30 to 33.
Okay, so if we're getting this 62 weeks, because it says if we're gonna appoint, we're gonna understand the appointed prince or the appointed one. If we're gonna understand that of Christ, you have this, and I'm assuming this is intentional. I know that was something that was brought up in the debate, that the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks are separated.
Yeah. So
when it comes to the 62 weeks until the anointed one is cut off, I'm assuming that's talking about the crucifixion. Where does the chronology kind of lead our dates? Does it lead in the right direction, or slightly off? What's going on with that?
So if you take the 7 and 62 together, or 69, that brings us right up to 27 AD, right when you're about the beginnings of the beginning of John the Baptist and Jesus' ministry. And then if you take that 1 week, it ends at 33. So it's actually really interesting. No matter where exactly you put the ministry of Christ, every date that scholars agree on is right in this range. Just really interesting. But yes, this is where the biggest difficulty comes for our position. Is they'll say, why is the 7 and the 62 distinguished? Why wouldn't it just say 69 if our reading was correct? And actually, in the Hebrew grammar, there's something called an atnach right after the 7 weeks, which is basically like a semicolon. So they'll say, right, until an anointed prince, there will be 7 weeks, semicolon, and 62 weeks in the street, and the wall will be built again. So first you have 7 weeks for the coming of an anointed prince, and then 62 weeks for the rebuilding of the walls. That's their argument. And so then they'll say the anointed prince here, it can't be Christ, because this has to come within the first 7 weeks. So first of all, it could just be this is a different anointed prince. But if you go like 49 years out from 457, you get 408 BC, which like nothing important happens there. So this is probably, that to me does not seem like it. But there's, I think, 2 good reasons to doubt this. So the first thing is that we don't know what the original Hebrew grammar looked like here, because Hebrew originally only wrote vowels, or rather only wrote consonants. They did not write vowels or punctuation. So vowels and punctuation begin to be written down about the 6th through 10th centuries. So this is long after the time of Christ. Now, most commonly, the vowels and punctuation that's given in the Masoretic text is usually quite fine. But I don't think we can regard it as the final word on this, simply because it's so much later. Like, they're not in a better place than us. And when we see other translations, like other ancient translations in languages that do include grammatical marks, we do not see that grammatical mark here. The other thing that jumps out to me is that if you look at, right, so that first list of 6 things, right, to finish the transgression, to make an end for sin, and so on, there's an atnach right after to bring in everlasting righteousness. So, like, the verse above inserts it in a place where we can be perfectly fine to translate it as a comma into English. So it does not seem, in the context of Daniel, that we even if we accepted that Hebrew grammar, that has to be absolutely certain there, that you have to translate it exactly as a semicolon, because the purpose of the punctuation was actually for liturgical chanting. So that way you would, when you were, because if you're just reading Hebrew, you can usually figure out what the vowels are. You might mess it up on your first reading and then fix yourself real quick. But you want it all to be really clear there when you're liturgically chanting it, so that way you don't mess anything up. So it could very well be that the rhythm of what they're using at the time needs that in order to fit it. So that's why they inserted it there. So there could be many other reasons. So to me,
my mom will sometimes send me like random Hebrew, like things that she sees in Hebrew, and she's like, "What does this say?" And they have absolutely no vowel points on it because it's modern Hebrew. And I'm like, I only took like 2.5 years of Hebrew, which is just like nothing in a language, a Semitic language. And I'm like, 2, this has absolutely no vowel points. So even if it was lucky enough that I could remember it, there's no way that I'm going to be
exactly.
able to
I can't even pronounce like Hebrew without the vowel points, so it's not helpful.
Exactly. So you're saying that this really is meant to be taken as a whole, like it's not meant to be taken as something after 7 weeks and something after 62 or something like that.
That's what I think here, because then this asks the question, why are the 7 weeks singled out? Well, this is 49 years, which is the length of a Jubilee cycle. So possibly, actually, this is a dispute. This is what my opponent brought up, is he brought up, hey, the later Jewish tradition actually says a Jubilee cycle is 50 years. And actually, interestingly, and like when the popes instituted the idea of a Jubilee, we used 50 initially, but we were just taking a idea from it. We weren't necessarily following the exact law there. And we actually, I think the earlier Jewish interpretation we see in the Book of Jubilees seems to be a 49-year cycle. So my opponent brought up, as he said, yeah, but the 49th year is not the Jubilee, because it does say after the 49th year, then you celebrate the Jubilee year. But the Jubilee, there's a debate in the Talmud about, all right, is this a 50th year? You add in, so it's a 50-year cycle, or is the first year of the next cycle the Jubilee year? And so if that first year of the next year is the Jubilee year, well, then you still have a 49-year cycle. And so the reason it would be singling out 7 weeks is that it's wanting to emphasize, like, hey, this is like a Jubilee times 10. Because what happened to Jubilee? Everyone's debts were forgiven and they all returned back to their land. So it's sort of a mini being freed from debt and being freed from exile, which of course points forward to what Christ did. Like, Christ institutes like the ultimate Jubilee. And interestingly, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they described the Messianic age as like a Jubilee year. So in the time of Christ, people were looking at this sort of thing and seeing in the Jubilee a sign of the Messiah.
Okay, so it seems like there's two things going on. I'm curious how the chronology is going to fit in with this, because you have, and these things sound very much like what Christ did. Finish the transgression, make an end of sin, atone for iniquity, bring everlasting righteousness, end vision and prophecy, anoint the Holy of Holies. And then you see something else interesting, that he's going to be cut off, but not for himself. So he's being cut off for his people.
So this is where we had a translation dispute, which he brought up in his closing statement. I realized I never addressed during the debate. I really should have addressed that in one of my rebuttals. But he deals with, but not for himself. This is a very obscure Hebrew phrase here, which is ve'ein lo. And it literally means something like, in not for him. But he takes, I'm not sure how you could get this out, but I did see it in a number of Hebrew translations. So this must be possible, but I'm not sure grammatically how it can be, where he takes it as, but he will be not. So he actually used this to argue against the resurrection, where he said, hey, the guy who's going to be cut off here, it says he won't be anymore. Versus, I'm taking it as he'll be cut off, but not for his own sake. And the thing is, like, the way, like, it's a prepositional lamed contracted with I'm pulling it up here in my Hebrew text here again. What is this? Verse 26, I think? Or is it verse 25? Let me figure this out.
Yeah, it's halfway through verse 26.
Yeah, so
I was just telling people in the live chat, this isn't that hard to understand, and you're like, it's a prepositional lamed, and I'm probably like one of the only people who understand like what that means.
So basically, in Hebrew, you just like in English or any language, you can put prepositions at the beginning of a word to basically give the intention of it. So it's sort of like you're basically saying for the sake of when you put that lamed in front of a word. And then it's contracted with the Hebrew word for he. So that seems to me, for him, is what it should mean.
Yeah.
And the word before means but not. Everyone agrees on that. So but not for himself seems like the right translation to me. But I'm not an expert in Hebrew. Like, I'm studying biblical Hebrew right now. So I don't know. Like, I'd like to understand better why some Jews at least pick the translation they do here of, but he will not be. But at the very least, it does not seem like, it seems like both at the very worst are possible translations.
I mean, assuming, like, having an assumed, oh my gosh, I forgot the grammatical term. Having like an assumed like copula right there, like a reflexive, like that he will not be, like the be right there. That seems really weird to me, to be honest.
Yeah.
For all that my little amounts of studying Hebrew will bring forward. But yeah, when it comes to that, I found it to be interesting. But I guess the bigger question I think a lot of people are going to have is, yeah, sure. I mean, if we were to read this apart from the chronology, like this just like exactly sounds like, what goes on with our Lord and the person and work of our Lord, and then what goes on with the destruction of the temple. But the difficult part that I think he brought forward, and that your opponent brought forward, and that a lot of us are going to have is, okay, well, yeah, the chronology might fit in, and the work might fit in for it being Christ, but what's going on with it? It's seemingly saying that it's going to be Christ cut off. He's going to do the work, and then there's going to be the destruction of the temple. But we know that the destruction of the temple happens exactly 40 years after the work of Christ was accomplished on earth, and he ascended into heaven.
Yeah, so this is where there's a lot of prophecies, right? This tends to happen with prophecy. Like, it'll look one way at first, and then it's actually fulfilled. And you go, oh, that wasn't how I was expecting it, but it doesn't violate anything the prophecy said. And I think that's how we have to take it here, right? That it could very well be that before it's fulfilled, that would have been the more obvious reading. But what does it actually say? It says, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off, but not for himself, and the prince of the people who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, it doesn't say in the last week that will happen. It says after the 62 weeks. Because then it has, and he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he will make sacrifices and offerings to cease. So this is the issue, is do the sacrifices ceasing, are they necessarily tied to the destruction of the temple? And it does not seem to me that that actually has to be the case. And it's very interesting that actually the Talmud here records a very helpful detail, which is that 40 years before the destruction of the temple, which is exactly the middle of the week here, God ceased to accept the sacrifices of Yom Kippur, because we would have a crimson thread at the temple that God would miraculously turn white every year to show that he had accepted the offering. But exactly starting in 30 AD, he did not accept it. It ceased to turn white.
Yeah, did they not realize when they were writing that how that sounded?
And then what's
Like,
interesting,
I wonder what else happened in 30 AD.
And then right after that, it says that the doors of the sanctuary opened as a sign of the coming of the destruction of the temple.
Which
is not
would be the
exactly
ripping of the
tearing
veil.
of the veil, but it's really, really close to the tearing of the veil.
Yeah, that is. That's quite interesting.
So to be fair, I don't think we can use that on its own, but I think in the context of everything else, it's very powerful. Because, like, I read one rabbi, and he was like, maybe actually the God ceased to accept the sacrifice because so many Jews were following this false Messiah at the time.
So what's what's sort of like the normal? Because it seems like, at least for me, from what I heard in the debate, and then from what you've said so far, it seems like we at least have a consistent reading of this, even while, somebody may try to poke holes in this detail or in that detail. I get why somebody would do that, but what is a sort of normal Jewish way of reading this? And is this, because it seems like they may be able to poke holes in us, but they just have no coherent way of reading this.
Yeah, so what they basically say is that Daniel prayed for this period of, he said, look, we haven't repented in the 70 years. And then they take it as Gabriel is coming to tell them, hey, I'm going to actually give you this 490 years to repent instead, because you haven't repented yet in that 70 years. So they take it actually in reverse. We take it as, in this 490 years, the Messiah has to come. They take it the other way around, which is that in this 490 years, the Messiah can't come. And then if you guys repent in this 490 years, right when it's up, the Messiah will come. So, like, in Judaism, there's a belief in... Oh, can you guys hear me? I am...
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Frozen. Okay, cool. So they take it as he cannot come in this time. So there's a Jewish tradition, for example, Jews believe in reincarnation, that the soul of the Messiah was created on the day of the destruction of the temple. So that way, up until that time, rather, since the destruction of the temple, in every generation, someone has had the soul of the Messiah. And then when the people are righteous enough, then it will be revealed who the Messiah is. That's not every Jew. That's not Jewish dogma or anything. There's other Jews who think Hezekiah had the soul of the Messiah as well. But it seems to me they flip it around. And so this is why I... pointed to this Messianic fervor in the first century, because it really seems like Jews at the time of Christ were taking this as a prophecy of the time in which the Messiah would come. And I think the Bar Kokhba revolt is sort of the last hurrah of that attempt at having a time where it would be like this Messiah would come. But then after that, it just simply is too far off.
Yeah, I found that to be interesting as well. Because it doesn't seem like because obviously we don't have from the Second Temple period a bunch of exegetical works. The best we have is the literature of basically, how do I explain it? Basically vernacular language summaries or paraphrases. That's basically what we have. But it seems like, from the effects of that Messianic fervor, that we can see that this was at least the common or a common interpretation of the Daniel 9 prophecy, and that the post-first century Jewish interpretations are novel. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I think that's the case. I really think, and at the worst, let's say you weren't sure about the chronology, it really seems like the destruction of the temple is the end date for all of this stuff to be fulfilled. It's something I also point out to Jews, is that they actually have a principle that a positive prophecy will always be fulfilled, but a negative prophecy won't always, right? So when Jonah goes to Nineveh, this is the classic example, and he says that in 3 days Nineveh will be overthrown. That wasn't fulfilled because the Ninevites repented. And so they'll say, if God comes and gives you a warning, you have that time to repent. And if you repent, the bad thing won't happen. But if God, because they'll also say then, well, how can we be certain the Messiah will ever come then? And they'll say, well, God promised us a Messiah. That's a positive prophecy. And God will always fulfill a positive prophecy. Like if you threaten to punish your child, if they stop acting the way they are, you're not going to punish them. But if you say, I'm going to give you this, no matter whether you're good or bad, you're always going to do that. And so this prophecy here is saying all this stuff is going to happen in that 490 years. Like it really seems like then this is a positive prophecy of when the Messiah is going to come. And it violates their own principles of exegesis to say that the Messiah would not come in this time. Now, it could very well be, right, that then their sins blind them to seeing the fulfillment of the Messiah, which is our view. And so that actually seems to fit much better with our view of why they didn't accept the Messiah, rather than the other way around, that the Messiah didn't come. But in Daniel's whole prayer is he asks them to, yes, God, to have mercy, not on account of our righteousness, but on account of your great mercy. So it seems very clear from the earlier context of Daniel's prayer is that this has to be a prophecy that cannot be fulfilled based on human merit. Because if it was based on human merit and Daniel had just prayed like, hey, do this for not for our merit, but for your great mercy, Gabriel would have come and be like, no, start acting right. Like this is going to have to be on your merit and nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. That's like a really strange way of getting about it. Is just like, we didn't do good enough. Sorry.
Yeah. So there's lots of Jewish questions like, why didn't the Messiah come? And one idea is that actually there has to be one Shabbat where every Jew is going to be righteous. There has to be one day where all the Jews keep the commandments and stuff. And it's like, you've had like 3,500 years to try that and it hasn't worked yet.
Yeah, with the liberal and conservative Jews, I'm sure.
Exactly,
because it's going to be over.
I'm still a Jew, and if any women convert to Catholicism, all of their kids will be Jews by this definition. So you got to trace down also like every single person of matrilineal Jewish ancestry and get them to do it as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure my great grandmother was a converso on my mother's side, so it's game over.
We're gonna have to.
I guess I apply to. I guess I apply to. I'm gonna have to keep a good Shabbat as well.
Yeah.
But what's I wanted to ask as well about in verse 27 when it says he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he'll make sacrifices and offerings to cease, and on the wing of abominations will be a desolator until the determined destruction is poured out on the desolator. So what's going on there with the middle of the week?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is that this is when God ceased to accept the Yom Kippur sacrifices. And this is the culmination of the whole sacrificial system. So sort of throughout the year, people would come and they would confess their sins to the priests and they would offer sacrifices at the temple, and sort of everything would be collected up there in the temple. And then on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and he would offer two sacrifices there at the Holy of Holies, which is the Holy of Holies is basically symbolic of the Empyrean heavens. So like Christ ascended into the Empyrean heavens in his body and is there now, offering the eternal sacrifice there. He would go there, and then they would also send out a second sacrifice, really a third one, out into the wilderness. And so we see this with Christ, right? He went outside the city gates in order to be sacrificed, and then he ascended up into the heavenly Holy of Holies. So he fulfilled both halves of that sacrifice. But yeah, we see that sort of was the ultimate thing that actually made the whole sacrificial system work. So we see for the next 40 years, like when St. Paul went and visited Jerusalem, he offered a sacrifice there and stuff. So it does not seem that even the church forbid all sacrifices there, but there was that period of transition of 40 years of moving people over to the new sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of the Mass, which fulfills it.
Okay, I think my internet cut out for a second. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. So what I was interested kind of now, unless there's anything else you want to say specifically about the prophecy, I kind of wanted to get into the chronology debates.
I'll say the one thing that I'm very uncertain of is what is the wing of abominations. I looked at a number of different commentaries, and really no one knows what this is. The Talmud suggests that actually right before because the word wing there could actually mean a corner. So the Talmud suggests that shortly before the destruction of the temple, that the high priest actually put idols at the corner of the altar in Jerusalem, and that this was the reason that the temple was destroyed. But that doesn't seem like there's any evidence that happened for me, but it's a possible one. Some people, Jewish commentators, suggest the wing here is a reference to like the wing of the Roman eagle, but it's really not entirely clear like what that section means there, but I don't think it's relevant to everything else here.
Okay. I was going to ask if Hasan had anything that he wanted to add before we move on, but... Oh, do you have anything you want to add about specifically the exegesis of Daniel 9 before we move on to the wider chronology that happened in the original debate, now that we have all this interpreted, contextualized, everything like that?
Well, the most I would say is that basically there are a few, and Gideon knows there's like a few different positions and arguments on the meaning of the parts of Daniel 9, and especially this prophecy. But none of the Jewish opinions make any sense, regardless of which one you take. All of the Catholics are going to team up and say, "Wait, we're arguing about these verses, but what about this one?" It doesn't make any sense.
The biggest thing you'll see here is that the Jews will often say, look, and it says anointed one, or it has anointed prince and then an anointed one. And they'll say the word anointed doesn't necessarily mean the Messiah. And unfortunately, the King James translated anointed here with a capital M, like a capital M Messiah. So they always love to go to the King James. And they say, see, the King James mistranslated as the Messiah, because in the Hebrew, it just has Mashiach, which could be any anointed person.
But we don't care about the King James, so...
Yeah, exactly. First of all, like every modern, I don't know of a single like English translation besides the King James that translates this as like capital M Messiah. Like everyone else uses anointed here. The second thing is that Rashi, who's like the most important Jewish commentator, he actually says this is about the Messiah, but it's neither of the two Messiahs like mentioned. So he takes that last part, until the determined destruction is poured out on the desolator, and he adds as a commentary on that verse, this will happen in the days of King Messiah. So, like, he agrees there's a third, this is about the Messiah. He just thinks it's none of the two people mentioned who are named Messiah here. It's a third unmentioned Messiah that all of a sudden he adds into this passage that isn't mentioned.
Okay. So so when they talk, this is kind of strange to me because they also mention the building of a third temple as well, correct? Which we obviously know is the temple of Christ's body, the temple of the church.
I thought you were about to say something else, but
the typological, but and then unless you're dispensationalist, then I grew up when I grew up hearing about Daniel 9, I always grew up hearing about like the week and the week ceased, and then the week they go to Revelation and say that the week is gonna once the temple is built again, it's going to, have to finish and everything like that because Christ stopped the last week when he was crucified. So do they connect this prophecy in with the third temple since the second temple thing? Do some of them do that since the second temple thing didn't really work out for them?
Not really. They tend to point to the last 8 chapters in Ezekiel for the temple. And that's actually something I'd like to research more. Hasan and I were discussing this, that the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel give a really detailed description of the temple. And that's sort of a big argument they'll make to us is they'll say, hey, it doesn't just say a temple. It gives very detailed instructions about how to build this one. So this is something I'm hoping to do more work on. But Hasan mentioned to me how St. Gregory the Great has a very good commentary on this. So I'm going to look into that more, so we'll be ready to respond. But no, they'll just basically say that this abomination of this desolation has been poured out on the temple, and that this desolation will continue until the third temple is built.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now did you want to, since we got all this through, did you want to move on to because this is very extensive. This is very detailed.
Yeah,
and complicated stuff around the chronology stuff, because the chronology stuff, that's what you guys focused on in most of the debate. And it seems to me kind of from an outsider's perspective, the chronology stuff that's a little bit less important than the exegetical stuff. If you just exegete the passage very straight, with what is more clear, and then kind of disputing over what is less clear, it at least excludes the Jewish view and includes the Christian view, despite what you're going to argue about when it comes to the chronology.
Yeah, so I think that I guess I don't really need this up on screen to talk about the issue there. But yeah, essentially, so the reason I actually think the chronology is so important here is because in order to make their interpretation work, the Jews have had to completely mess up like 165 years of human history, which is well recorded and that can easily be refuted, which actually shows how much, like, it's not merely, right, we're debating about some word here. It's that they've actually themselves have had to admit, to make their prophecy work, have to accept a completely incoherent conception of human history. And so essentially we have lots of independent cultural references, right? Because this is what I said. It's like, look, ancient Egypt, right? We have sort of lists of pharaohs at various times. We have people who sent letters so we can figure out they lived at the same time.
Yeah.
But even like Egyptologists don't 100% agree on when various pharaohs reigned. But it's actually around the time of the Babylonian exile that there starts being pretty much unanimous agreement within about a year of when everything happened after that. So you can have issues again, right, of when exactly. So if you have, for example, the Hebrew and the Persian calendar start at different times of the year, how are the Jews counting the 7th year of Artaxerxes? Right? That'll shift you a year or so, right? But you're not going to get some hugely different number. Like versus like with ancient Egypt, there are debates of like what century events occurred in.
Yeah.
So there's much more room there, but it just seems like we have such good evidence of this time period. To give an example of this, it would be like if someone had some reason, for example, let's say, for example, they found some biblical prophecy. Let's say, for example, Protestant found some biblical prophecy that Jesus is going to return upon the 100th anniversary of America. And they decide that this is going to be 2026. So they start trying to squeeze all of American history into the last century. They said, actually, the Revolutionary War occurred in 1926. And then they'll have to say, all right, the Civil War, maybe that occurred in like the 1930s. And then you could have World War II. World War I maybe occurred in like the late 30s. And then we get World War II, then we'll agree. All right, at World War II, everything happened the same. Or like the guy who was debating me, he took the view that actually all these recorded Persian kings, they were around, but they happened later. So this would be like saying, hey, yes, we think the U.S. was founded in 1926, but we don't deny that like World War I and World War II and the Civil War all happened. We just think they all occurred like at the same time. Like that would essentially be like the level of the sorts of things that we would have to do in order to try to make the chronology fit. That's the level it's going to here. So what he did to try and argue against it is he basically picked out a obscure set of letters from some Jews who lived in southern Egypt, and then they were writing contracts with like surrounding Egyptians as well as with Persians that they were trading with. And so they used a lunisolar calendar at the time, which means every 19 years, you add 7 leap months to 7 different years. And this will change at different times in history, which months are the leap months. And so he argues that actually these certain details here line up better with when the leap months would have fallen according to the Seder Olam chronology than would have fallen according to our chronology. But you can't, that's the thing is like, you can't take little details where, hey, maybe this leap month actually occurred in a different year than we thought it did, and jump from that to, therefore we can remove 165 years in history.
Yeah, I mean, that's not even, I guess, to make like a scholastic distinction. That wouldn't even be a property of the calendar. It would just be like an accident that could be shared amongst many different calendars. So it's like not even, it's not even positive proof for your case. It's just like, if I were, for example, to, prove that a dog has the faculty of smelling, and then say, oh, humans have the faculty of smelling as well, therefore that dog must be a human. It's I listened to that, and that part was particularly confusing to me because it wasn't even really positive proof of their case. It's just simply on divine authority from the presupposition that Christianity is not true and that we need to make this calendar something different.
So he's drawing on a series of arguments here from Rabbi Alexander Hull. And I tried to get Hull's book because I wanted to actually see what all the arguments Hull was going to use are. Because I figured there was one other author who's also done a similar sort of thing. I looked through that author's work as well as far as I could find. But I wanted to find Hull's book because Hull wrote a whole book on this, trying to do a revised chronology of this. But unfortunately, it's from the early 2000s, and it's sold out literally everywhere. Like, it's not even like you can pay $1,000 to get it shipped from some obscure website. Like, it's literally out of print everywhere. So I actually don't know where he managed to get a copy. That was pretty impressive of him. But yeah, he and I have actually been talking about, I'd like to go through all, like, if I have that data, I'd be happy to go through all of it. A part of the issue here is they're going to start hitting very quickly on primary sources that are not translated. And we're looking at like 7 or 8 different cultures. You're going to have to know like 7 or 8 different languages. And a lot of these are not printed either. So you're going to have to start reading like cuneiform tablets and stuff to start getting into some of these issues. So I just went and I looked and like, look, the guy who, the 2 authors who wrote the standard reference work for the chronology of this period in Babylon, who he himself cited another page from their works. He cited their work on intercalary years in order to make his argument. They say that the chronology of this period from 625 to 75 AD is accurate to within a single day. And maybe they're overstating the case. Maybe it's by a year. All right, but they don't think, and they actually list for almost every single person who ruled Babylon, they have tablets from Babylon from the first year of their reign and the last year of their reign, and they list them. Like, there are multiple tablets for almost every single one of these people.
Yeah, so it would be, yeah, that's, there's some like periods or there's some areas in the United States in like, I don't know, like early obscure like state representatives or like even on like a state governor where we just don't have that many primary sources, where we don't even have that much material establishing a chronology for them. That's it's kind of insane.
As I tried to use Greek history because everyone knows it well. Like, I was pointing out to him, his chronology would mean that Alexander the Great lived before Socrates.
Yeah, which would be crazy because Socrates' student student was the teacher of Alexander the Great.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, look, we have clear Greek records that Socrates taught Plato, attested in multiple different sources, that Plato taught Aristotle, and that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. We know what Persian kings were around during the reigns of these respective people, and Plato refers many times to different Persian kings in his writings. So we know what same with Aristotle. We know what Persian kings had already lived by their time. And then, in his view, though, so we know that Alexander actually fought Darius III, but he has to say that Alexander fought Darius I. And then he says that, all right, the Seleucids and Ptolemies, the Ptolemies ruled over Egypt, the Seleucids ruled over, like, Babylon, but the Ptolemies did not take all the way over, like, modern-day Iran. They actually ceded that back to the Persians. So, like, Xerxes and these other later kings, he says they're local rulers in Iran. But, like, we have tablets in Egypt about Xerxes putting down revolts there. Like, did he just march his empire through the Seleucid Empire into Egypt to put down a revolt in a kingdom that he did not control? And, like, what was his motivation for going to war with Greek city-states? Like, were the Seleucids fine with him just marching through their empire to go invade Greece? Something I didn't mention is, what about the March of the Thousand, the Anabasis, right? Is there a civil war between, where the main battles all occur in modern-day Iraq, over the succession of an empire that did not exist in Iraq at that time? Like, there's all sorts of little details here that, as soon as you start walking into Greek history, we have so many records from Greek history that you're walking into a giant landmine there. And he basically is like, oh yeah, all those are interesting questions, but like, these letters from these Egyptian Jews don't really fit our chronology. So don't you think that, like, that shows we need to rewrite all of this?
Yeah, that's like a surprising, fideistic affirmation right there. That's like shockingly bad, because really it's not only everybody knows Greek history, but it's something which is from multiple different empires, multiple different cultures, all at the same time. and such a like shockingly off chronology in order to interpret, a passage from Daniel 9, so it doesn't say what it actually says, and then we don't actually know what it means. It really does seem like grasping at straws.
Yeah, and what's interesting is this is an area that like no one debates with Jews about. Like even Michael Brown, who's one of like the best apologists against Jews, he's a evangelical Christian. He when he deals with this prophecy, he just says, "Look, I'm not going to debate the chronology and stuff, but we see here that it says that all this has to happen before the destruction of the Second Temple. So I'll just defend this occurs before the destruction of the Second Temple." But I think it's useful to get into the chronology here, because once you get into the chronology, you start seeing how much Judaism just collapses here. And this is actually, it starts messing up other stuff in Judaism as well accidentally, because there's all this whole theme of in Judaism that the Messiah is going to come before the year 6000. But if you don't follow this chronology, it's already past the year 6000 on the Jewish calendar. So you're already too late for the Messiah to appear. But if you move it earlier, they still have about like 2 centuries left to get the Messiah here. And so this then poses, and to be for a lot of Jews, if you ask about this, they'll say, well, if the Messiah doesn't come by the year 6000, I guess we'll keep waiting. So it's not knocked down there. But there's lots of little things in like Jewish mysticism, especially, that are related to the Jewish calendar that stop working once that Jewish calendar, you realize it's off by centuries.
Is there anybody in, secular? Not that I care a bunch about secular scholarship, but usually on stuff like this, they're fine. Is there anything in secular scholarship or any sort of secular scholar who would actually defend the Seder Olam way of, chronologizing, I guess?
No, there's basically, I know of 2 rabbis who've written attempts at it, like in revised chronology. But even most people who do revised chronology don't defend them. I think the debate that goes on in Jewish scholarship is about the reasoning for it. Like, was there some motivation either for the destruction of the temple to line up with this, or the Bar Kokhba revolt to line up with the years, or was it just that they had gotten so far away from Persian history that they accidentally messed things up, and this is actually kind of a mistake that it lines up. So there's some debates about why it ends up the way it does. But I don't know of anyone who does defend it. And this is also an issue, is that secular scholars, they think this prophecy is originally about the Hasmonean Wars, and that Daniel was sort of a forgery written around that time. But the 490 years also don't work for the Hasmonean period. Now all of a sudden you're too short.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously you can't like post-date Daniel or Daniel chapter 9 after, the destruction of the temple or anything like that.
Yeah, so that's the thing, is we have records. We have physical copies of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like within decades after the Hasmonean revolt. So not enough that you can prove definitively, right? It came before.
Yeah.
But we know that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or the Pharisees and the Essenes both accepted this book, and they were mortal enemies.
Yeah, and there's also the
and this is supposedly propaganda for the Hasmoneans, and the group that is the successors of the Hasmoneans, the Sadducees, they're the only people who don't accept this book. So like it doesn't even make any sense at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Is there what are sort of the, and Hasan might be able to go on this, because obviously, we know that the Jewish way of counting, or at least the way in which the apologists argue, is not really realistic. But what are the different ways in which Catholic authors are going to disagree on terms of chronology or anything like that?
Yes, so the big ways, first of all, going to be, what decree is it? There's actually a more common opinion among the fathers, because Julius Africanus attempts this calculation, that he says that this is the final decree, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which is actually misses by about then like 13 years or so. So what they try to do then is they say, the Julius Africanus had the theory that because the Jews had a lunisolar calendar, that actually this means 12 only lunar years. And so therefore, he tries to line up the number of months, and he says this cuts it short by just enough years that you end up with the right year as well. And this is actually a common opinion among the fathers, because Africanus did the hard work of the calculations, and very few people after that are going to want to try and do the hard work of the calculations again. So it's not surprising that a lot of people stick with that one. This sort of actually gets revived in the modern period, but with this really absurd idea that there was an idea of a prophetic year in Judaism of 360 days. And you ask any Jews about this, and they just don't know where this prophetic year idea is coming from. Like some random dispensationalist author made this up, and no one knows where it's coming from.
Yeah, dispensationalist authors just making stuff up. They do it all the time.
Yeah. The next thing is going to be, is that anointed prince, is that after 7 weeks? Is that someone else? Rather than Christ, does someone appear around that time? And then the third one is going to be that final week. Is that final week the week of Christ? Or is there a gap between the weeks, and that week is either the destruction of the temple itself, or is that the coming of the Antichrist? Now, it does seem to me that there might be a typological recapitulation going on, because it is interesting that the Jewish-Roman War goes on for 7 years, and it sort of actually matches what happens in the 7 years of this week. And then the period of the Antichrist is going to last 7 years traditionally, and again, it's going to sort of match up with this. So it seems to me that this history repeats these patterns. That's what's going on. So I don't think because of that we have to disregard church fathers who use this as a prophecy of the Antichrist. But I would disagree with those fathers that this is the primary meaning of it. And again, there's some fathers who take it as the first ones. This is an area where there's no patristic consensus.
Yeah, is there any sort of connection with the Apocalypse of St. John?
So that's the big thing, is they'll point out that the Apocalypse of St. John keeps using different language, basically, for 3.5 years, which seems to line up with 3.5 years before the sacrifices are cut off and 3.5 years afterwards. And there's a lot of resonances between Daniel and Revelation. There's one spot at the end of Daniel where Daniel basically asks, when is all of this going to occur? And the angel tells him to roll up the scroll, and you're not going to know for a while. And then the book of Revelation, John is given a scroll, and he's able, the seals are broken, then he's able to unroll it. And so a lot of, I don't know if it's actually the fathers, but I've at least heard people interpreting it this way, as perhaps this is the scroll from Daniel that was sealed. And so Revelation is unfolding some secrets in Daniel there. And there is quite, if people are interested in Daniel and the Antichrist, I'd recommend taking a look at St. Robert Bellarmine's book on the Antichrist. But there are a lot of fathers who draw language from this about the Antichrist, but it seems to me that a lot more of it is fulfilled in the first century than is sometimes taken to be, but we can still understand these recapitulations.
There's actually, with the, I guess this is a plug for the Ignatius Study Bible, despite the issues that are in there.
Mine's
really
never going to arrive.
Yeah, yours is never. Nobody else is going to arrive except mine. I guess they wanted the Wagner review.
They
so
told
they
me
had
to
to
arrive
send
in
mine ahead of time.
190 years, but I've been waiting another 2,000.
Yes, so true. That's real. But the connection also with the Olivet Discourse. There's stuff going on with Daniel, Olivet Discourse, Apocalypse of St. John, and especially where was it? I think it was the note on chapter 5, chapter 6, or somewhere around there. But there's a connection that goes on with some of the, I think it's the, let me see, some of the seals. Yes, the breaking of the seals and the judgment, connections between Luke 21 and then Revelation 6. The wars, both Revelation 6:2 and Luke 21:9, international strife, Revelation 6:4, Luke 21:10, famine, Revelation 6:6, Luke 21:11, then pestilence, persecution, earthquakes, cosmic disturbances. All of these are the exact same order and line up very nicely. So it's very interesting how those three texts are in line, and they're also all talking about the destruction of the temple. So yeah, I am myself much more inclined to interpret Revelation as referring to the destruction in 70 AD. But obviously we know with the way in which prophetic fulfillment works, there can be both a proximate and a remote fulfillment, both as the judgment of God on the Jewish people for their rejection of the Messiah, then also the judgments that occur at the end of the world as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree there. This is the thing, is that if the prophecies were only relevant to a certain time. Like, they would not be handed on to us. It's because by studying all these events, we learn the patterns of how God works in history, and then we can see what will occur in the future as well.
So did you have any sort of line of investigation that you wanted to go down, or did you want to move on to questions? Hasan as well, if you wanted to say anything, you're more than free. You're muted. This man, Hasan, you're muted.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, you didn't say, so you had nothing that you wanted to say?
Well, I guess I think the main point is that I would make is that there is a point to bring up that because we and the Jews, not all Catholic authors in history, but substantially Catholics and Jews agree that the fourth kingdom is Rome.
Mm-hmm.
It basically completes for us that, like, if any Christian can convince a Jew that Daniel 9 probably refers to Jesus Christ, then he should become Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of if a Catholic is a person discussing with him.
No, I think so, because this is why I think what Alan Femister's book Romanitas here is so important, because we inherit not only Israel, but we also inherit Rome as well. And so I think this is very important. It's actually interesting that I heard this from Femister, that there was actually a debate between a Jew and Saint Cyril at one point, the Saint Cyril of Cyril and Methodius. And the argument the Jew gives against it is, he says, hey, Saint Cyril, you're a citizen of the Roman Empire, and the Messiah is supposed to defeat the Roman Empire in a war. So, like, how can the Messiah come? How could the Messiah have come if the Roman Empire is still here? But first of all, we've inherited. And secondly, that creates a big issue for them because the Roman Empire isn't around anymore, at least in their understanding. So they'll try to figure out who is the Roman Empire today. Like, there's one rabbi I've watched quite a bit of, who he's actually a Russia is the third Rome defender, so that way he can still have Rome being around.
That's actually hilarious. Yeah, like, trust the plan, guys. Actually, and the czar dying has nothing to do with this ending. It's really Vladimir Putin who's the Roman emperor right now, and the Messiah will come and defeat Vladimir Putin. Okay, so is that sort of like it on the discourse part of it? Did you guys want to get into questions? Because there were a few questions.
Yeah, get into questions. There's some people in the chat I saw were discussing the issue of the Antichrist. Yeah, I just say to people to look at St. Robert Bellarmine's book on the Antichrist there.
It's also part of, if you get is the full Grant translation of on the Roman Pontiff, it's a part of it. So if you wanted to get the whole rather than just a part, it's there as well. But Catholic David, he had a question. Hello, David. How are you doing? These are actually right here, my knickknacks. They're very good. They're from David. But what is the traditional Catholic appellation for the identity of a racially Jewish convert to the faith? Catholic, Jewish, both, or neither?
So it seems like this was different at different times in church history. So you'll see, for example, at some points, Roy Shulman pointed this out in one of his terms, that there was times they were referred to, for example, as Israelites, but that's very confusing nowadays, because confusing with Israeli. Other times you'll see Jewish, other times Hebrew. There's various things. I think that the current movement has emphasized much more the use of Hebrew, just to make it very clear in distinguishing it both from, like, Judaism as a religion and from the modern state of Israel and so on. So I think that Hebrew is actually, I think, a very useful title that has come about. But there's various times, and if you look at the history of it, there's been various times in church history, there's been different approaches. Like, people will sometimes take out particular periods of how there was approaches to Jewish converts, and then jump over and say, therefore, this has to be the way in which it's always done. But the church has the authority to bind and loose. And if you look at, for example, Ex Quo by Pope Benedict XIV, he mentions this is even in regard to certain rituals that could appear to be Judaizing are not necessarily so if the church permits them. So there was canons in the past where the church decided, all right, pastorally, the best policy is just to basically have Jewish converts become assimilated. I think this was because at the time where there was great political advantage to move from from Judaism to Christianity, you really had a fear of false converts. And so therefore we want to let's make sure these aren't false converts. But I think in the modern day, that's first of all no longer a fear. Like nowadays, all the political pressure is on us to remain Jewish,
Yeah.
And that's not to say we shouldn't be careful. Like I do think that some people sometimes go too far in jumping into enculturation without the guidance of the church, and I think this needs to be done. But I do know that like there are bishops, and not like liberal bishops, like very, very conservative bishops like Cardinal Burke and Patriarch Pizzaballa, who are supportive of proper amounts of enculturation for Jewish converts. There's discussions at the Vatican I know of as well. So there can be different times in which different policies are pursued that are not necessarily for some liberal end. And I actually think a big thing that we could really do here is not necessarily with looking at evangelizing Jews, like as practicing Judaism, but in terms of Messianic Jews. So there's this whole movement nowadays called Messianic Judaism, which some of it, like in America, it's much more so like Protestants who have no liturgical tradition and really want one, so they decide to follow the Jewish liturgical tradition. But you also have somewhat in America, but a lot in Israel. And I've heard anywhere from estimates from 10,000 to 50,000 of Jews there who believe in Jesus, but they want to retain their Jewish heritage. And a lot of them are actually discovering that the Protestant theology doesn't make any sense from a Jewish perspective. And I really feel like a lot of these people that are being misled, that they feel like the answer has to be in the rabbinical tradition. So many of them will support things like rebuilding the temple or stuff like that. And so I think this is highly problematic. But just like we have the Anglican Ordinariate to win the Anglicans back, I actually think that one of our main people we could help win over is the Messianic Jews. And interestingly, one of the leading Messianic Jewish theologians, Rabbi Mark Kinzer, he's actually very positive towards us. So he actually wrote a book on Catholic ecclesiology, trying to argue how Messianic Jews could be incorporated into the Catholic Church. And then Father Antoine Levy is a Dominican, actually wrote a book responding where we can agree, where we can't agree. And he's actually been in talks with the Vatican for like the last 25 years about these sorts of issues. And he actually recently set up a ecumenical Jewish Christian fellowship together with Father Antoine Levy. And
Antoine Levy, he's amazing. He's a Dominican. He's done work on Palamism as well. He's really sharp.
Yeah, and I think if you read his work, he's very balanced on this, trying to avoid the extremes on both sides.
Let me send his academia.
Because I know some people will be like, why won't you engage with me? Who will post all sorts of insane stuff online, like why won't you engage with me, calling me a Judaizer and stuff. But look, there are people of different opinions on this who I engage with happily, right? But there's some people who basically want to slander anyone who does not agree with them as a Judaizer, as a heretic, and so on. They slander even very well-respected theologians like Dr. Lawrence Feingold, like Father Antoine Levy, and even Cardinal Burke I've seen. So they take very well-respected theologians. I mean, people, you could look at, for example, right, there's one of the bishops nowadays who's very popular among Draper types is Patriarch Pizzaballa. He's very supportive of my approach to things. So it's not like I'm trying to take some approach that is entirely outside the realm of where discourse is among people who are very clearly Orthodox Catholics, who can have, I was reading recently an article by Dr. Matthew Levering, who seems to be a bit more cautious about some of these things. And that's very well. One of my theologians, one of my closest friends, is not in agreement with all of my opinions on this. I'm happy to dialogue with people of different opinions. But when I click on some people's account, and all they do all day from morning till night is post about how the Jews are destroying society. Look, there's no use in engaging with someone like that.
Basically,
I have no comment on that.
It'll just make it impossible for you to get anywhere as well if you platform those people.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean that's genuine. It does genuinely, in many cases, cause active scandal. It's just true. When you're trying, for example, I remember I even got in hot water at time for making a comment of correctly pointing to the nature of the Talmud, because the Talmud, yes, I absolutely agree that there are very horrific, very evil statements within the Talmud. I'm in total agreement of that. But the Talmud isn't like something that if you ever seen the size of the Talmud, some guy didn't just sit there, one author, and write the whole Talmud. Like that's completely ridiculous. It was like a collection of various sayings of rabbis over time. So like you can blame individuals like within that collection, but it's not like it's completely without use. That's just like ridiculous.
And it could very well be, right? So let's say, for example, we come to the table, right, and all we do is we yell at them. They have some horrible passages about us and about Jesus in the Talmud, and they yell at us that we have like bad stuff about them and some of the church fathers, and then we never get anywhere, you know?
Yeah.
Versus, I think we can have a much more productive discussion about the areas where there's actually theological truth to have. And look, we're entering a world where there's very few people who are theologically conservative. And look, if you see like a Jew online who is just attacking the church nonstop, attacking Jesus, saying horrible things, like, yes, of course, respond to that person with like you don't have to be like the nicest to that person. But it's the same thing with engaging with Muslims, right? There's going to be some Muslims who are just going to want to cause drama with us. Well, obviously you can just either cause drama back with that person or not engage. But there's also other Muslims who disagree with us who will be polite and have discussions with us.
Yeah.
And so I think it has to be approached on a case-by-case basis. But I will say, I think the opinion of the Jewish community about Jesus is changing quite a bit. Because it used to be, right? If you look at works, even up until quite recently, they had very negative views about Jesus. But now there's actually this whole movement in Judaism to want to sort of reclaim Jesus as a like Orthodox Jewish rabbi who Christians have misunderstood. And they want to say like St. Paul corrupted it all. And obviously I don't think that's right, but that's probably a lot better than like what they've been saying about him in the past, you know? And like there's a Jewish guy whose YouTube channel I've been on quite frequently. And he even said that he was like, look, when I was in yeshiva, which is their version of seminary, he said, and I was reading the Mishnah and it was talking about these rabbinical debates. The Mishnah is part of the Talmud. He was reading about these rabbinical debates that were occurring before the destruction of the temple around the time of Jesus. I thought they were anachronistic. And then I read the Gospels and Jesus engages in the same style of argumentation. And actually, if you look at the list of topics that Jesus is debating on, like divorce and stuff, these were the sorts of issues that were hot-button issues, according to the Mishnah, in Jesus' day. So this actually, in a sense, he was like, for me, reading the Gospels vindicated, like, that these are actually much more reliable sources about the past than I thought they were. It's like, I thought these were just theological ones. And I do think, like, when you talk with Jews about the New Testament, they have very different sorts of objections, because they're attuned to looking for different details than we are. Now, I think the reason that's such an issue with Paul is that Paul is writing to Hellenized Jewish communities. Yeah. So he's writing to people, like if you compare him to Philo, he's very similar to like the style of writing in Philo. Jesus is existing in like Levantine Jewish communities in Judah and Galilee. So it's going to look, the Mishnah was compiled in Galilee. So it's going to look a lot more like those sorts of debates. And it's actually interesting, I think, sometimes to speak with Jews, because they'll notice little details. Like, for example, as well, the disciples come up to Jesus and he gives ask, how do we pray? And he tells them the Our Father. That's actually a common sort of event that happens in the Talmud, is the people go up to the rabbi and they ask him, how do you pray? And he'll give them a prayer and stuff like that. So lots of little...
Is there any... I'm curious, is there anything with like 1st and 2nd Corinthians? Because I know that that probably would be the closest thing, to something that they would be familiar with. Like they basically like the giving of like a juridical judgment when it comes to controverted moral issues.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. There's a
reason. I know, like with at least when I was learning about Second Temple Judaism, at least 1 Corinthians, especially. Which text in particular am I thinking about in 1 Corinthians? I can't remember off the giving of the judgment, not from the Lord but from me, like that section, like that actually one of my professors pointed out that that's actually like a statement that sometimes is made for a judgment that is made on one's own authority, like a juridical judgment.
Mm-hmm. It would be interesting to look into. I think one of sort of the hot button issues in like unbelieving New Testament scholarship nowadays is that the Book of Acts claims that St. Paul was a student of Gamaliel. Mm-hmm. Now, Gamaliel is a very famous rabbi during the time of Jesus. And this is what I've seen that's disputed, is that they'll say, yes, maybe Paul was a legitimate Jew in the Second Temple period, but they'll object he does not read like a Jew in the line of Gamaliel. And the reason we know what sort of Gamaliel's style of teaching was like is that actually the Mishnah are the descendants of Gamaliel. Actually, Gamaliel's interesting. He's sort of the last figure at least, that both Jews and Christians claim as their own, because they think he's sort of the sage who's the father, literally, actually, in some cases, of many of the sages in the Talmud, versus we actually canonized as a saint in our church. I say maybe because it's actually a Jewish tradition that St. Peter was a fake convert and actually was secretly still Jewish and wrote a famous Jewish prayer.
Yeah, that's funny. So the first I heard about the Gamaliel controversy. How do you pronounce him in the Hebrew way?
Pronounce it differently, so I'm actually not sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the first I heard about this controversy was actually like Jimmy Akin wrote. Despite what you think about Jimmy Akin, but Jimmy Akin wrote an article and he was talking about how this was like an anti-Semitic thing to say that he converted to Christianity and to call him a saint.
This is like. Actually, this is something that I think can actually be an interesting issue for looking at the typology of the relationship between Christianity and Judaism here. Because we often group, right, the Jews in Jesus' day into two categories. There were those who followed him, and there were those who explicitly persecuted him in the church. But that's actually, I think, not what we see. There's actually a third group there as well, which is like Gamaliel. Because when in Acts chapter 5, the early church is brought up to the Sanhedrin, and the Sadducees and some of the Pharisees want to persecute the early church. But Gamaliel does not want to. He actually says, like, look, we don't know if God is with them or not. Look, God could be with them, and if that's the case, and if they are against you, like, you could be found persecuting God. You could be found persecuting the people of God here. Like, you don't know, so remain neutral. And I actually think this gives us an interesting case for engagement with Jews. Because if that's the case, the Jews understand themselves not as the descendants of those who explicitly persecuted the church, but of Gamaliel, then we can say, I think Gamaliel did later convert, and I think that's actually a sign of the Jews who are not opposed to the church eventually converting. But I think if they were the descendants of that, we can say that, look, that's not enough, that the Jews should make the full affirmation that Jesus is the Messiah. But at least being in this neutral space where they neither support nor oppose it is a much better place, where they're open to him being the Messiah. I've even talked with some Jews who say, look, maybe Jesus will be the Messiah, but right now he has not fulfilled enough of the prophecies for us to affirm that he is the Messiah. And so I can take that, I think, possibly as a third category for how we might relate to Jews that I think could actually open up some avenues towards better relations.
Yeah. So the next question is from Giovanni. Thank you for the big super chat. I appreciate it. Your explanation last night on the parable of the vineyard owner and what it meant was excellent. Thank you deeply. I sent it to all my Dispy friends, but they latched onto the end. You say that, quote, ethnic Israel will be saved. Undid the Catholic pill. Can you explain? Yeah. So this basically comes from an interpretation of Romans 11, and is my like audio fine? At least I know that my video is probably weird. Yeah, but with the interpretation that traditionally is of Romans 11 and is magisterially sanctioned, this interpretation is that because the promises of God are irrevocable, and there is a certain promise to the Jewish people. And also the idea that this cannot be fulfilled in a way that is now through the Old Covenant, because the sacraments of the Old Covenant are dead and deadly now. Because of all of these facts, that when it promises that all Israel will be saved, this is in reference to a certain period before the second coming of Christ, which is traditionally spoken of among Catholic authors when they talk about eschatology. That Israel will be saved as a sort of sign that immediately precedes the second coming. That's the whole idea, and this is the way in which we keep. This is the way in which we keep kind of the sort of center between. On the one hand, you have like the dispensationalist types in the Protestant world, and then the the two covenants heretics within Catholicism on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the supersessionists, which, you know, it's a lot of people by supersessionists. They basically mean, oh, is like the church is the new Israel. That's not what supersessionism means. Supersessionism actually is a Protestant ideology, typically found among Reformed authors, that's based on something called covenant theology. And in covenant theology, this holds that the sacraments of the old law were saving, which is explicitly contrary to what St. Paul says in Galatians and in a number of places throughout his corpus. Rather, Catholics hold that, you know, Old Testament saints were always saved through the new covenant. The new covenant was always the means whereby in faith in the future Messiah, they were saved. So when rather the old covenant sacraments were occasions of grace rather than causes of grace, like we framed the new covenant sacraments, which work ex opere operato. So where was I? Oh yeah, so the Catholic position goes between this and holds that while of course the church is the new Israel, and the old Israel does not have in its possession the sacraments of salvation or the covenant whereby they are saved, there are certain promises of God that are given to old Israel, and these will be fulfilled in the Jews coming to Christ. Which is weird to me that a dispensationalist would have a problem with this, because often dispensationalists will accuse those who hold to supersessionism as being anti-Semites, as hating the Jews or whatever, because they don't, you know, hold to, and they also accuse them of not taking seriously the promises found in the Old Covenant. But actually, I think the Catholic view would be quite appealing to a dispensationalist who would both recognize that there are genuine promises which are given to Israel, which are to be fulfilled. And on the other hand, that obviously the New Testament teaches, especially throughout the parables of our Lord, that the mantle is being taken away from Israel and handed to the nations.
Yeah, I actually, a lot of people jump immediately to St. Paul, and that's what I used to do as well until I noticed actually some passages in the Gospels that I actually think St. Paul is alluding to here. One of these is this parable of the vineyard owner. But you notice in the parable of the vineyard owner, he quotes, our Lord quotes Psalm 118, the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. There's actually another spot in his ministry where our Lord quotes Psalm 118. This is in two different places, in Luke 13 and in Matthew 23. And in both cases, he's disputing with the Pharisees. And he tells the Pharisees in both cases, he says, "Behold, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And this is, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, is again from Psalm 118. And I think this is here. Christ is saying, I like to look at more commentary stuff, but it seems to me that what Christ is saying here is that upon his second coming, the Jerusalem establishment will recognize him, and they will declare, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Like this, the Jews will recognize Christ upon his second coming, because part of Christ's mission was to be king of the Jews. And so the fact that the Jews did not recognize him, right, even though he was king of the Jews objectively, they did not recognize him as their king. And so I think part of the ultimate fulfillment of all these prophecies is Christ being the king of the Jews there. And that will happen upon it. It's interesting, if they're praying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord when Christ returns, that means they're praying Psalm 118. So they're praying that the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So that's finally a recognition that they were the builders, but did not recognize the chief cornerstone.
Yeah, I actually think there's stuff interesting in this as well when it comes to the Apocalypse of St. John. And I think a lot of people miss this because they're usually like, haha, you know, it says Synagogue of Satan and they call themselves Jews, but they are not. Like, haha, you know, this is really funny. And like, okay, well, on the one hand, that's like rhetorically, you know, whatever, like I get it. But the statement of the 144,000 as being like a statement of completion of all Israel coming in from all 12 tribes. And also there's like a parenthetical statement from, I think, Revelation 5. I'd have to pull it up. I think it's Revelation 5, and it talks about how they will fall before the feet of the saints and might not be Revelation 5, but it mentions something to the effect of those of the Synagogue of Satan who call themselves Jews, that they will like bow before the saints or bow before the Lord or the Lamb or something of this nature. I can't remember the exact verse off the top of my head. Maybe it isn't from 5. I can't find it right now. But this seems also to be a statement of the Jews coming in and actually converting to the Lord. I'd have to look and find that again, what I was thinking of.
I want to do another study now of Revelation. Now that I've been doing all this new research, because
I've been reading Revelation, and I've been reading St. Bede's commentary and some of the notes from the Ignatius Study Bible. And Revelation's actually a lot more interesting to me now, especially that I'm thinking a lot about the stuff from the Old Testament. You can't understand Revelation if you don't understand the Old Testament. I think the NASB, I heard this somewhere, but the NASB has all of the references to the Old Testament. And there's more references to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation than there are verses in the entire book. It's just always going back to the Old Testament and showing the fulfillment that will come.
I think this is always one of the interesting issues in a lot of the Protestant debates, is that they want to go sola scriptura. The average person can understand this, and then jump to like the hardest things in theology to understand, like predestination and the book of Revelation, and then base orthodoxy based on these like hardest parts.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, somebody were pointing to, maybe it was Revelation chapter 3. Oh yeah, it is. It is from the letters to the okay, let me see. Oh yeah, here it is. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet and learn that I have loved you. I mean, this could be like a statement of judgment, but it also could be a statement of like genuine conversion, to where they come back and recognize that actually the Gentiles are their have received the promises of God, and they come and repent of their warring against the church. There was another. Thank you again, Giovanni, for the super chat. I hope this was something which answered your questions.
Yeah. I also want to say that any future prophecy like this, I always want to be careful, like not to overinterpret it, because I do feel like there's probably a lot of the Jews overinterpreted what they thought the Messiah was going to be like, and then things didn't work out like they had guessed, and then they did not realize it when it was happening. So I do think with any of these future prophecies, it should always be with a little bit of an asterisk over it. If that makes sense.
Okay, so Gabriel, he said, Michael Brown argues Jesus is Messiah but uses sola scriptura. How can we show Jewish seekers that apostolic Christianity rooted in sacred tradition / apostolic succession is Judaism's true fulfillment? I actually have, I cannot remember the specific Hebrew word for it, but there is something interesting with apostolic succession that we can take from the Mishnah. Or do you remember what?
Yeah, so I don't remember the exact word, but no, Jews do have apostolic succession from Moses. And I mean, I don't necessarily trust the Jews' records going up to our Lord's day, but our Lord affirms that they sit in the seat of Moses there. So he clearly affirms that they are the legitimate successors of Moses there. And then they have their own continuations down there. And it's interesting, this occurs in Matthew 23. It's the very beginning of Matthew 23. But at the end of Matthew 23, this is when he says, behold, I will not come again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So it seems to me that there may be some sense in which, like, these rabbis are still in some sense the successors of Moses, like that there is still some continuing thing there. Not necessarily that they have authority like the church does, but I could see some sort of connection there. I don't know entirely what that would mean. But
it was the Samika that I was thinking of, yeah.
I do think there's something important here, again, with our apologetics with Jews. I so often see people critique the Jews for following the Talmud rather than like just the Torah alone, as though the issue is like the Jews are not following sola scriptura and that's why they're wrong. And so this is a big reason why I'm very cautious with critiques of the Talmud going too far, because I feel like it's very quick till we start doing it, because there's certain cases where the Talmud does seem to contradict our tradition about the meaning of certain laws, but there's a lot of cases where we don't know if it does or not. Well, you could very easily find yourself mocking what is a legitimate tradition handed down from Moses all of a sudden.
And this is actually a problem, and this connects with something Trendy was asking about that I want to get to later. This is like a legitimate problem within certain, like, not obviously these aren't church fathers, these are just ecclesiastical writers, like the Epistle of Pseudo Barnabas, for example. You get certain early church apologists from like the generation or two after the apostles who like go on and mock a lot of the Jewish customs that end up being from the Old Testament. They're like mocking, the like the keeping of the Sabbath, and not like the aspects of the keeping of the Sabbath that we're like, okay, this is trying to trick God, but like certain like genuine, very clearly laid out Old Testament customs, and it does come down to, in a lot of ways, the critiques of Judaism being like a crypto-Marcionism.
Yeah, the thing is that I found actually a lot of Jewish apologists know the church fathers better than some of these Protestants going to try and evangelize Jews, because these Protestants, a lot of them, they're very low church evangelicals. They don't believe in going back and looking at the tradition. But Jews very much believe in going back and looking at traditions of interpretation. So all these Jewish apologists, they go and they read the church fathers and they see this stuff and they try to use it to try to be like, look, the early Christians, they just hated Judaism entirely. They basically will try to take like the most incorrect stuff in a few early fathers, and we'll try to use that to disprove us. And so I think that is something to keep in mind, just for us to be careful around these sorts of things.
Yeah, the what I was thinking of was Samicha. Basically, what's super interesting about it when you read it, there's like a conferral of authority by the laying on of hands, to where one becomes the image of the one who has laid their hands on them. So that, like, this is sort of the idea that we see behind apostolic succession that I was talking about. But thank you, Jeremy. I hope that was helpful for you, Gabriel. Let me Mystic Jeremy, he asked a question. Gideon has mentioned Hebrew Catholics advocating for their own ordinary-like structure with an inculturated liturgy. Will this work for Morisco Catholics with the Usus Moriscus as their liturgy?
Oh, man.
Hasan, that's you.
Oh, man. Okay. So I just want to be kind of clear about something. I don't want like Morisco Ordinariate. We live in very difficult conditions where people converting from within our cultures have got these like long-standing Christian communities that don't want to accept them, bishops that don't want to accept them, etc. We just want to be normal. We just want to be normal Latin Catholics that have certain awarenesses and insights about how to apply the like Catholic tradition, especially the Latin tradition, which is the main rite of converts to Catholicism from Islam, to apply it in full and to take Scripture seriously and apply it to life in full as much as is possible, etc. So that's basically the idea. The situation that we're in, unfortunately, is rather that we have to do this kind of strange, diffuse thing where our guys are technically under the local bishops once they get baptized, but they don't get any help at all.
Yeah.
And they're basically unrecognized. In other cases, they're kind of recognized. There are some places where they supposedly want to integrate them, but it doesn't look like that's real. But we hear lots of things. The things don't happen though. So basically the in terms of like liturgical specificity, the specificity that is universal to people from a Muslim background, whether they come from the diasporas in the West or whether they come from various different countries that have or ethnic groups that are majority Muslim, that common or universal specificity is very small. It's a very small thing, and it's simply a musicological tradition. At most, the use of classical Arabic, and then and the rest is like attitudinal, right? And it pretty much just is expressed through following certain parts of the Latin tradition more forcefully, more intensely, and with greater attention. That's it. So for the vast majority of things, it's not like introducing a whole bunch of like foreign imported stuff. Pretty much that's just the musical stuff, the language, and if there was going to be another one, I would say that there are useful genres of literature. We talked about this recently, like etiquette, that would be useful to write about, that would be useful to use from within Catholicism to write it. So that sort of stuff is what's actually useful to do. I'm like, there's also another concern, which is that rightly a lot of people who convert find a general abhorrence for the religion, because the things that characterize Islam for them are things that we recognize as problems, not the good things that they're inheriting, because they can find those things in our Latin tradition anyway. So there's a lot of people who are kind of like freaked out by too much aesthetic resemblance, things that like smell of syncretism to them, not because they have a specific problem with aspects of the heritage. They want to be very subtle and indirect about offering the heritage in the liturgy. They don't want to throw it away. They don't hate enculturation itself, but they want to be more subtle and careful, right? And if we're going to do that, if we're going to do it this way, we have to keep in mind that a liturgical project is the project of a community for the sake of the community's worship, and to remove obstructions to their ability to offer themselves in prayer. So if that's the case, we can't be doing this like top-down managerial 1960s style like revision of the liturgy for the sake of like maxing out a particular way of thinking or something. Maxing out like the Islamic character. That's not the goal. The goal is to help the people.
I also want to say I don't have any particular opinions on like what a juridical structure should look like for some like Hebrew Catholic presence in the church. And like right now, there's the Association for Hebrew Catholics, which is just like a recognized apostolate in America to put out various materials, but it has really no structure beyond that. And then there's the in Israel, there's the St. James Vicariate, which is directly under the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And that will probably be the case, that there has to be two different situations. One where you have enough Hebrew Catholics in one place where there's actual communities, versus in the diaspora where there's we're going to be in practice much more spread out. And so I have no opinions on what that looks like at all, practically speaking. That's why I try to jump around with words a bit, but not necessarily an ordinariate or whatever. I don't know what that would look like. And again, it has to be bottom up, not top down. So this is, I think, why now that there has been such a presence of this for a while, is why the Vatican has now begun thinking about these things, from what I've heard.
Yeah. It's best for it to be organic. But Trendy, he asked the question none of us want to answer. Do you guys think that priests like Monsignor June or Father Fahey's traditional approach to the question is totally outdated or defunct?
I'll say what I try to look at is writings of the saints and like doctors and like church documents. There's plenty enough to get us like to be politically incorrect nowadays that I try to stick with that rather than, because it's very easy to go down really dark rabbit holes really quickly. Like I've seen people do this where they start encountering some stuff, like they'll hear about like the Antichrist is going to be a false Jewish Messiah, and then they start looking at which Jewish group is about to bring about the Antichrist, then who's associated with that, who is that person associated with, who is that person associated with, and all of a sudden they think the entire world is run by like some big conspiracy. And then they start realizing, wait, like the popes and bishops are tied in with these people. So the popes and bishops must be involved in this conspiracy. And the thing is, that's not to say there aren't conspiracies and there aren't bad things that happen, but it's really easy to go down like a very dark rabbit hole really quickly and end up basically spiritually destroying yourself. And so that's just what I'd say, is to be careful with people about this.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the 20th century, with the activities of the political party that we all know that I'm referring to within the European sphere of things, there were like obviously genuine atrocities, and there obviously was pushback from some clerics who clarified the ways in which we disagree, and the way in which we also would not agree with like a sort of post-war consensus on this matter. But I guess I will stick with being vague on this. Hasan, do you have anything to say, or would you rather also stick with being vague on this?
I'm going to be quiet just in case I accidentally say something not vague at all.
Yeah, I guess I'll add to this as well. It's not like the post-war consensus is not traditional Jewish theology either. So I think this is an issue, is that often when we do interreligious dialogue, we like all retreat to like the post-war liberal consensus in order to try and have a discussion there. But like Judaism basically recognizes that like having they do not think that the government should have religious freedom and stuff like that. So it's not like they are agreeing with the post-war liberal consensus. Like, I think a lot of Jews have generally liked it because they've lived much freer lives than they have in many other points in history. But there's also many Jews I've spoken with who are very concerned about what's going on in society nowadays as well, and don't necessarily think that the post-war liberal consensus is good. There's plenty of like post-liberal Jews I've spoken with online and stuff like that. So I don't think that just because that we have to, because there was bad stuff happen to Jews in the past, that therefore the answer is the post-war liberal consensus. I mean, there was a case, for example, I was listening to a rabbi who's very well known, talking about some stuff, and they started going on a point about history, how the rabbis prayed for the victory of the Tsar over Napoleon, because they knew if there was Jewish emancipation came in, all the Jews would essentially become secular and leave Judaism, and there would be no more Jewish population in Russia after a few generations. So they actually felt like, look, all the persecutions we suffer under the Tsar, this is for the spiritual good of our people.
No, it is that's an interesting perspective. We'll keep that to that, Trendy. I hope that you appreciated that. How much significance does Rome have in Jewish messianic thought, and does it link to our view of Rome? I think you kind of answered that earlier. If you wanted to, give us the LDR
so too.
On that.
Yeah, that basically they think Rome. They have to still defeat Rome. That Rome's still in the future.
So that's so stupid, by the way.
Yeah.
What we're gonna do is, okay, guys, in the 21st century, what we're gonna do is we're gonna wait for a Messiah who's going to defeat the Roman Empire, and he will be somehow known to be descended from David.
And also, once he defeats Rome, everyone's going to immediately recognize that Judaism is true, and everyone's going to want to convert like immediately.
Yeah,
so true.
Rome. It's going to be Russia as well, by the way.
That's one theory. There's different theories going around. The rabbi I'm watching, he mentioned people keep sending me WhatsApp messages about stuff. So apparently there's some big debates going on in like Jewish WhatsApp groups, at least according to this one rabbi I was listening to. But
that is kind of cursed.
Here's a question for you.
Someone else mentioned they have this whole theory that the Romans are descended from Esau as well. They try to have this whole theory, and it does not work at all. There's a bunch of prophecies about how the Messiah is going to defeat Esau, and like Esau is clearly not around. So this is a big issue they've had to face.
How do we interpret the verses about defeating Esau?
I'd like to look into that more as well. I do think there could be maybe perhaps an immediate application of the defeat of like the Herodian dynasty went away, and like there's no more Edomites very shortly after Christ. Like I wonder if that is an immediate application, but I'd like to look into later spiritual applications as well.
So Wagner, how are you speaking without moving? As a quick note, for some reason my my Ethernet cord is not connecting right now because StreamYard's being weird. So this is just going off of my Wi-Fi. So that's why it's kind of weird. But yeah, what were you saying, Gideon?
I'd like to look into more how we interpret these verses about Esau, because there's debates among Jews, right? Is like Rome spiritually Esau, but there is a strong amount of people in Judaism who will try to say, like Rashi says, there's a list of descendants of Esau in Genesis 35, and one of them is named Megilad, and Rashi comments on that this is the ancestor of the Romans.
Yeah,
which is funny because the next guy is named Iram, which sounds way more like Rome. Like you should have picked him, but.
So, Trendy, you don't need to buy the Talmud on CD. You can just go to Sefaria. Is it Sefaria.org?
To be fair, the translation on Sefaria is like really, really bad, but it's the only one you can get for free. So,
and it's not even complete.
Yeah, there's
But no,
there's
so,
the
so
Safaria thing.
something to be careful with the one on Safaria is that the words in bold, that's what's actually there. The words that are not in bold are not actually there and are added in by the translator to try to make it easier for non-Aramaic speakers to read it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, Giovanni. I think Hasan answered that. And then Mystic Jeremy. What is it about the Eastern rites that appeal to Jews versus the Latin liturgical tradition, or is it the Novus Ordo Missae that isn't appealing to Jews?
In my experience, I don't know what exactly it is about it. I think it might just be the cultural thing that most Jews either come from the Middle East or Eastern Europe, and so the Eastern rites are culturally much more similar.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see whether there's like that trend among Sephardic Jews.
When there was an attempt initially at enculturation it started under Pope Pius XII. The state of Israel was founded, so there was an idea. There were some Catholic converts there that wanted to start doing evangelism there. And so the initial plan was to use the West Syriac rite and have that in Hebrew. So they translated it into Hebrew, but they couldn't find enough priests to celebrate it. So they ended up translating the TLM into Hebrew and used that for a little while, and then used the Novus Ordo once that came about.
Also, the West Syriac liturgy is like the proper liturgy for Jews from the Near East.
I agree, yeah.
Yeah, because it was... There's lots of evidence that it was a Jerusalemite church. Then they expanded to pretty much most of the Jews of the Near East. And then they started accepting Gentile Semitic converts.
Yeah.
And then they became the majority, and they dissolved and assimilated into one group. So,
yeah, because Syriac, I mean, it's another dialect of Aramaic, and Jews use both Hebrew and Aramaic as liturgical languages. Like, quite a number of our prayers are in Aramaic, not in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. That's why, have you ever seen any of the discussions about what language should the Jews use when they move back to Israel just before, like, the Hebrew revival movement?
I'm not sure, but I do know there was a revival of Hebrew going on at the time, because I encounter a lot more Jewish sources that are in Hebrew, which are usually easier to get translated than that. Because, like, the Ram Hall, who I think is interesting, is he's very much like a classical theist type guy who studied at the University of Padua in the early 18th century. So I think he was familiar with scholasticism, even if he doesn't name it. But he's writing in Hebrew and stuff like that. So I know there was a revival going on before before Israel was even founded.
There were actually some people who talked about basically making use of Aramaic because it was already spoken in the region as a vernacular.
That makes sense, yeah. And it was spoken until quite recently by a lot of Jews. Like, I know a guy who said his grandfather spoke Aramaic, who were Persian Jews.
Yeah, a lot of Mizrahi spoke Aramaic, yeah. Especially in the mountains.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's about it. We've been going on for almost 2 hours now. I think this was good. Is there any closing thoughts that you had?
Unmentioned, Trendy just mentioned the Angel of the Lord issue, and I want to do more research into that because I know different fathers have different opinions on that. And the Angel of the Lord was actually really useful for me early on to come to believe in the Trinity. But I've heard people bring up significant objections to it, so I would like to do more research before I use that evangelistically.
Okay, sounds good.
I think what we should say to Jews is not that we can prove the Trinity to them from the Old Testament, but that it's reasonable to come to that conclusion. Just like they don't necessarily have like just plain generic monotheism, and they have this whole complex system of the Sephirot and stuff like that. So we could say, look, you guys have one tradition of how you resolve these complex details about God in your tradition. We have our own complex system. We have it. And so we disagree. What is the fulfillment of it? Is it Kabbalah or is it the New Testament? But both of us have reasonable approaches to it, so they should not be able to call us heretics at the very least for having a different conclusion about it.
I mean, historically, like in even like papal exegesis, though, I think, for example, in Innocent III's exegesis of Psalm 44, he just outright says that this should be used as a proof. But I think he probably doesn't mean that it's like strictly demonstrative from the text. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or at least he doesn't mean that this should be a proof which is apologetic, but rather dogmatic.
Sure.
Because apologetic and dogmatic proofs are very different.
I don't know. I think he does actually mention the Jews, but I don't remember exactly. Yeah. But I would say that in texts like that, you can, like Gideon said, if you show these points and you say your system doesn't successfully make sense of the data here, then that's
yeah. Or even so, we could say that perhaps this is what I usually say to Jews, that it's underdetermined, that there's not enough in the text alone to come to one conclusion or the other. Therefore, while it's not unreasonable for them to reject the Trinity, perhaps we could say, it's also not unreasonable for us to believe it, given that we also have this additional revelation that clarifies it, that we in no way are contradicting the Old Testament, that this is a reasonable fulfillment, at the very least. I think that we could argue that that's the bare minimum at which they would have to concede to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds about right. So is there anything that you wanted to, plug, conclude, anything like that?
No, I would say the one big thing is that I think that really, unfortunately, like internet discourse between Catholics and Jews has hit rock bottom. And what made me realize this is that there were Jewish inquirers into the church, or even Gentile inquirers, who would come to me about this. Like, I had people who were being scandalized away from the church by this. Like, I had one guy, so sort of the wake-up call for me, who reached out to me, where he's like, I really want to become Catholic, but, like, he's a Mizrahi Jew, and he's like, my ancestors, like, suffered to retain their Jewish identity in Islamic lands for, like, centuries. And he's like, I can't become Catholic. He felt like, at least, if what's going to happen is that all my kids are going to become anti-Semites. Because he saw the Twitter discourse. He assumed this is how most Catholics, like, think. And he had a significant concern that maybe he could, it's not dogma, so he could avoid it, but just because the culture is like that all of his kids were going to become anti-Semites. And that's a very significant concern that he had if he became Catholic. And so we have to remember, when we're out there and we're posting online, like, every single word that we post online is seen not only by fellow Catholics, but by those outside the church as well. And that there are lots of people who are more privately inquirers who are looking at internet discourse, and that is a sign to them. Because it's not like, I will say, I've never once in my life, like, encountered anything anti-Semitic at, like, a Catholic parish or anything like that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not an issue when you're in the Catholic Church at all. To, like, anti-Semitism is not an issue in America today, like, as a serious issue, right? Yeah. But the internet discourse reflects something very different. And so I understand why Jews like, imagine, right, if you are, like, a white non-Catholic and you want to become Catholic, and all you see is, like, liberal Catholics talking about how, like, if you want to be a white Catholic, you have to accept that, like, you can't identify as white anymore, that you have to hate your European identity, that you have to let your countries become overrun with, like, third world immigrants, right? And then you could imagine that, like, yeah, we're sending you back, Hasan, too. Sorry.
Send them back.
But, there are people in the online discourse that unironically want me to go somewhere anyway. There are people who've added me from these streams on Discord just to send me the message. It's nice that you're Catholic and everything, and that you're trying to spread the faith in the diaspora, but can you F off and get all the guys you convert to F off as well?
Yeah. The thing is, what you are doing is telling them to the converts who are in those countries to stay there and stuff. But I think
that's what we've been doing. But they're talking about people who convert in the West.
Exactly. Yeah.
Go back.
No,
yeah.
But no, you could imagine, right? If you're like, there's lots of white people have a big concern today about the fact that there's, like, serious issue with, like, anti-white racism in, like, the West today. And you can imagine if you stepped onto Catholic Twitter and, like, all the discourse was about how white people are evil, right? And maybe they even bring up, like, hey, look at these Catholic bishops. They're the ones wanting to bring in lots of immigrants to our country and stuff. The Catholic Church is against white people. There's this global conspiracy by the Catholic Church to destroy the West. You could, whatever truth there is or not to that, you could imagine how, as a white person, that would scandalize you away, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think there's a similar thing nowadays with the current state of internet discourse could very well scare away well-meaning Jewish converts. Because yes, ideally, we should just set aside, like, whatever earthly concerns we have and like, just follow whatever's true. But in reality, that's not how people actually make decisions. And so I think it's important that when we're in this public discourse, that we put our best foot forward and actually properly represent the Catholic faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything you wanted to say, Hasan? Or everyone watch the debate, by the way. That's the one thing. Watch the debate.
I think the one thing that I would like to say is that I think this sort of discussion that you had was a step in the right direction, and also that we need theology and interreligious dialogue to actually like be connected again, because right now they're two kind of disconnected things in practice, and a lot of interreligious dialogue is like retarded as well. Like I've seen it myself. I'm not talking about the online dialogue. I mean the like bishops having tea parties with muftis dialogue. It's just not useful. And basically replacing that with a serious return to scripture, that's how we impress people as well. Because if we actually recover the moral system of scripture and play it out, I mentioned this to you from Deuteronomy the other day, but Blessed Moses told the Jews from God that these laws which they were being given were going to be the principal sign that God must be the real God, because the wisdom of these laws could not have come from any man. So we have to live out the system, not just to have charity intensely, but to live out a wise system conducive to virtue, given to us by the sacred text, given and provided to us, preserved and developed upon by sacred tradition and divine tradition, so that we can be a very clear sign to Jews and Muslims that we don't have to be alien, like completely alien, like modern Western people to them. And also, not only that we don't need to be alien, but it's impressive to have a system of thought, life, and celebration that really comes from the text and is wisely ordered and interrelated in the way that it is. So I think that's the really big thing. I really like returning to Lapide, returning to this specific era of like commentators. I think that's the way forward. I think Salmeron, Pereiras, Lapide, Calmet, if we get these four guys and we bring them back into the culture of discourse, we're set, because everything else will follow, I think.
Yeah. I also want to put out one last note. I think the level of apologetic discourse in terms of academics, like on the online discourse, is a huge step forward, right? Compare like James White's debates about the papacy with people back in the 90s with the Eric Ubi Petrus debate, right? Where they were just like slinging like random stuff at each other in the 90s that had like nothing to do with anything, and then versus like the Eric Ibarra Ubi Petrus debate, where they were debating the details of papal authority in like the 6th century and going in like in depth into various documents from that time. So on that side, there's a huge step forward there, right? But I also think that those people, they grew up in a culture of much more etiquette. And we're coming in as like Zoomers that were raised in a culture without any etiquette. And so even though the quality of arguments have increased a lot, the quality of our witness, I think, has hugely dropped. And so I think we need to keep the improvement in arguments, that we're much better than the 90s apologists in terms of our arguments, but we have to have the sort of charity that I think was had in older debates that I think has been lost in a lot of more recent discourse.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the type of discussions that I'll have, in DMs or maybe on public Twitter with, educated Reformed people versus like you listen to like the James White debates on justification or something like that. Like these guys are asking me about like very intense like exegetical questions of how to read St. Augustine, and James White is just like, who is the blessed man? It's like and like crazy like tropes, basically that he kind of just like pulled out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a little over 2 hours. I enjoyed this very much. I'm glad that we had this as our friend. Let me see. Friend here said we had a very good dialogue. The white Jew and Indian dialogue. Very glad to have it. So I'm very happy.
He's Bangladeshi.
He's Bangladeshi, which is, to my knowledge, that's like a state of India, right?
Oh man, you guys suck.
Anyways, inside joke for anybody who's listening to the after part of this and is not familiar with us. But yeah, this was great. I think that we got all in that we needed to. And yeah, as always, God bless.
If you really enjoy this channel, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/militant Thomist. At the first level, you get access to the private Discord. At the second level, you get access to weekly bonus videos. At the third level, you get access to free translations, articles, and notes on the Summa of St. Thomas. On the fourth level, you get access to course videos and DM questions. And beyond this, there are many other benefits, so please make sure to check out patreon.com/militant Thomist. Do you want to have access to more videos and custom interaction whilst also helping out the channel? If so, please consider becoming a YouTube member. At the first level, for only $3 a month, get access to custom emojis to use in live streams and in the comment section. At the second level, for only $5 a month, get access to a weekly bonus stream. At the third level, for only $10 a month, get access to priority replies on all your comments. Click the join button below or the link in the description to find out more.